the investigation changed. The moment reporters stopped standing outside Nancy Guthrie's blood-stained front doorway and started gathering somewhere else entirely. Not at the Catalina Foothills home where the elderly woman vanished overnight, but outside another property connected to someone investigators quietly kept circling back toward behind closed doors. And when federal agents were seen carrying boxes of potential evidence out of that residence, the emotional direction of the entire case shifted almost instantly. Because up until then, most people believed the same thing. A masked intruder had entered the home, abducted Nancy in the middle of the night, and disappeared into the darkness before anyone realized she was gone. The surveillance footage, the missing doorbell camera, the blood near the entrance, all of it seemed to support a random home invasion. But investigators didn't appear focused on randomness for very long. According to multiple reports surrounding the case, detectives became increasingly disturbed by how controlled the scene appeared to be. There were growing questions about timing, familiarity, and operational confidence. The movement reportedly seen on surveillance footage didn't look chaotic, it looked deliberate. And once investigators began reconstructing Nancy Guthrie's final known timeline, one detail immediately became impossible to ignore. The last confirmed person to see Nancy alive was her own son-in-law. That fact alone proved nothing. Families spend time together every day, but emotionally the case stopped feeling random. It started feeling informed. Investigators now seemed less interested in the idea of a stranger appearing out of nowhere, and more interested in whether someone already understood the routines, vulnerabilities, and silence surrounding Nancy's life long before the night she disappeared. And that raised three deeply uncomfortable questions. Why did the crime scene feel so controlled? Why did investigators narrow their focus so quickly? And what exactly did federal agents believe they might find inside that connected property? When you first heard about this case, did you believe it was a stranger or someone close to her? For the first several weeks after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, investigators appeared increasingly focused on one uncomfortable possibility. Whoever entered that house may already have understood exactly how vulnerable she had become. Nancy was an elderly woman living alone in the Catalina Foothills, one of the wealthier and quieter areas outside Tucson. Neighbors described the community as peaceful, private, insulated from the kind of violent crimes people normally associate with late-night disappearances. That image mattered because it shaped the public's first assumption about the case. People imagined an outsider, a stranger moving through darkness before vanishing just as quickly. But routine became one of the most important parts of the investigation. According to reports discussed publicly after the disappearance, Nancy's daily life had become increasingly predictable. She reportedly followed familiar schedules, stayed close to home, and relied on consistent habits that rarely changed. To most people, routines feel comforting. To investigators, routines can also become operational information. And then there were the vulnerabilities. Nancy reportedly removed her hearing aids before bed each night. She relied on medication. There was no overnight caregiver inside the home, no active monitoring system watching her movements in real time. And investigators later examined whether the residence lacked several layers of modern protection that might have interrupted an intruder quickly. Those details became emotionally significant because they suggested something more disturbing than opportunity. They suggested exploitability. Investigators increasingly appeared unwilling to believe somebody could move through the environment that confidently without understanding those conditions beforehand. Because random offenders make mistakes, they hesitate, they improvise, but this case kept returning to the same unsettling word. Controlled, the final evening only deepened those concerns. Nancy had reportedly spent the night with family. Dinner, games, conversation, ordinary moments that now carried enormous emotional weight in hindsight. Nothing publicly suggested conflict. No witnesses described panic, fear, or visible tension. By all outward appearances, it looked like a completely normal family gathering. And then she was driven home. That moment became one of the most intensely analyzed portions of the entire investigation, because once Nancy returned to the residence, the timeline entered a dangerous gap. There was no independent verification confirming exactly what happened after she arrived. No rideshare record, no outside witness establishing a precise sequence, just recollections later reconstructed under investigative pressure. And then came the silence. No overnight communication, no calls, no text messages, no interruptions significant enough for anyone nearby to immediately realize something was wrong. Again, investigators understood that silence alone proved nothing. Families do not constantly check on elderly relatives throughout the night, but context changes interpretation. Then investigators discovered something more reliable than memory. According to reports later discussed publicly, the final transmission connected to Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker monitoring system stopped during the early morning hours. That detail transformed the case emotionally, because now investigators had a technological marker narrowing the operational window surrounding the disappearance. At some point before dawn, Nancy was no longer where she was supposed to be. And once investigators placed that timeline beside everything else, the vulnerabilities, the routine, the controlled nature of the scene, the missing overnight hours, the case began feeling far less random than it initially appeared. Because if someone already understood how isolated Nancy would be that night, then the most disturbing part of the investigation was no longer the disappearance itself. It was the possibility that the sequence may have been understood in advance. What exactly happened between Nancy returning home and the silence before dawn? The deeper investigators moved into the physical evidence surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The more one detail continued bothering them. The scene did not feel chaotic. Experienced detectives are trained to recognize the emotional signature of random violence. Panic leaves traces. Unfamiliar offenders waste time. They hesitate near entry points, improvise under pressure, and often create disorder they never intended. But according to analysts and former investigators publicly discussing the case, this scene appeared unusually controlled from the very beginning. That distinction became critical. The reported movements surrounding the residence did not suggest confusion. It suggested purpose. The timing looked narrow. The operational window looked precise. And perhaps most disturbingly, whoever approached the property appeared to move with unusual confidence during hours when Nancy would likely have been isolated, asleep, and unable to hear movement clearly inside the home. Investigators could not stop returning to that point, because confidence inside a target environment usually comes from one of two places: experience or information. Then came the surveillance issue. According to reports surrounding the investigation, the home's doorbell camera was physically removed during the early morning hours. That detail immediately changed the emotional structure of the case, because it suggested intentional disruption, rather than impulsive violence. Someone did not simply avoid surveillance. They allegedly neutralized it, and that implied planning. Former investigators publicly analyzing the case repeatedly emphasized how important that distinction was. Removing a camera requires awareness. Awareness requires attention, and attention raises another uncomfortable possibility. The offender may already have known exactly where the surveillance systems were positioned before the operation ever began. The stranger theory still dominated public opinion at that stage. Most viewers watching the story unfold continued imagining a masked intruder randomly targeting an elderly woman inside a wealthy neighborhood. The image felt emotionally familiar because random violence is psychologically easier to process. It creates fear, but it also creates distance. Investigators, however, increasingly appeared to be moving in another direction entirely. The deeper they reconstructed the timeline, the more the operation seemed to involve knowledge that felt difficult to explain through coincidence alone. Whoever entered the property appeared to understand the layout, the timing, the vulnerabilities, the lack of overnight interruption, even the silence surrounding Nancy's routine. Again, none of that independently proved guilt against any specific person. Investigators themselves remained careful publicly, but behaviorally, the sequence reportedly began resembling preparation more than improvisation. And then another theory entered the investigation that changed the case emotionally yet again: signal jamming. According to reports later discussed publicly, analysts explored whether specialized equipment may have been used to interfere with wireless systems surrounding the residence. If true, that possibility carried enormous implications, because signal jammers are not impulsive tools. They require planning, research, and prior awareness that wireless devices even exist inside the target environment. That realization deeply unsettled both investigators and the public, because now the case no longer looked like someone stumbling into opportunity. It began looking like someone potentially constructing an operational advantage in advance. Someone who may have already understood the house well enough to predict how much uninterrupted time existed before anyone noticed something was wrong. And once that possibility entered the investigation, the emotional direction of the entire case shifted again, because investigators were no longer simply asking who entered Nancy Guthrie's home that night. They were beginning to ask something far more dangerous. What if this operation had been developing long before the night Nancy disappeared? By the next major phase of the investigation, the case had transformed from a local disappearance into a national obsession. Reporters remained embedded outside properties connected to the story for days at a time. Former detectives began publicly dissecting timelines on television. Online analysts reconstructed movements frame by frame, and behind all of it, federal investigators reportedly continued building a behavioral and forensic picture of what they believed happened during the missing overnight hours. The pressure surrounding the case became relentless. Every new development seemed to push the public toward the same unsettling conclusion. Investigators no longer appeared focused primarily on finding a random intruder. They appeared focused on reconstructing a sequence. That distinction changed everything emotionally, because experienced journalists understand something the public often misses. Investigators reveal priorities through movement, which homes they revisit, which vehicles they examine repeatedly, which locations receive extended forensic attention. And during this stage of the case, one detail generated enormous public attention. Federal agents appeared intensely focused on a property connected to Nancy Guthrie's family orbit. According to multiple reports, evidence technicians spent extended periods processing the location. Items were reportedly removed from inside. Vehicles underwent examination. Observers following the case noted something especially striking about the activity. It did not feel exploratory. It felt targeted. That perception fueled growing public speculation. What exactly did investigators believe might exist inside that environment? At the same time, another detail quietly intensified the investigation even further. Reports later discussed publicly suggested investigators subpoenaed digital records tied to searches involving Nancy Guthrie's address months before the disappearance. That revelation landed heavily because it introduced the possibility of reconnaissance. Again, searches alone prove nothing. People look up addresses for countless innocent reasons, but timing changes interpretation. Investigators reportedly appeared interested not simply in the existence of those searches, but in the sequence surrounding them. If someone had repeatedly examined the property long before Nancy vanished, then the case potentially involved something much darker than spontaneous violence. And once planning entered the emotional structure of the investigation, motive became unavoidable. That was when conversations surrounding money, inheritance implications, and possible financial pressure began moving closer to the center of public attention. Investigators never publicly confirmed every rumor circulating online, and accounts varied regarding the exact nature of family financial dynamics. But analysts following the case increasingly discussed whether relationship strain or long-term financial concerns could have influenced investigative direction. Because crimes involving elderly victims often force investigators to examine uncomfortable realities, property control, dependency, inheritance structures, and financial desperation, the ransom notes only deepened those concerns. According to reports surrounding the case, multiple communications were distributed not only to family members, but also to media organizations. Behavioral analysts publicly discussing the investigation noted something disturbing about the language itself. The messaging reportedly felt psychologically informed. Specific emotional pressure points appeared directed toward the family, rather than broadly toward the public. That detail mattered enormously. Strangers tend to threaten generally. Familiar people threaten specifically. And the more investigators analyzed the wording, the timing, and the emotional targeting inside those communications, the more the case appeared to drift away from the image of a faceless outsider emerging randomly from darkness. The public began emotionally crossing a threshold. At first, people feared a violent stranger capable of entering a quiet neighborhood unnoticed. But now many were beginning to fear something else entirely. The possibility that someone already inside Nancy Guthrie's world may have understood her vulnerabilities long before the night she disappeared. That possibility changed the psychological weight of the case permanently. Because betrayal is harder to process than fear. And the deeper investigators moved into the timeline, the more the case stopped resembling randomness. By the third major stage of the investigation, the emotional center of the case had shifted away from the disappearance itself and toward something much darker, the possibility of long-term preparation. Investigators never publicly announced that conclusion directly, but according to analysts, Former detectives and reporters closely following the case, federal authorities increasingly appeared to believe this operation may not have been spontaneous at all. The evidence seemed to keep pointing back toward planning. The timing looked precise. The surveillance disruption appeared intentional. The movement around the property reportedly suggested familiarity rather than panic. And perhaps most disturbingly, whoever carried out the operation seemed to understand Nancy Guthrie's vulnerabilities with unusual intimacy, her routines, her isolation, her limited ability to hear movement at night, even the narrow overnight window before anyone would likely notice something was wrong. That realization changed the emotional meaning of the entire investigation. Because if the offender already understood those details beforehand, then the danger surrounding Nancy may have existed long before the night she disappeared. The controversy surrounding activity at the residence only intensified public suspicion. According to reports circulating online during the investigation, vehicles connected to family members were repeatedly observed near the property while the case remained active. Again, investigators never publicly suggested criminal meaning behind that activity, and innocent explanations obviously existed. Families secure homes after traumatic events. Practical responsibilities do not stop simply because tragedy occurs. But emotionally, the timing unsettled people. Nancy was still missing, not declared dead, missing. And for many observers, movement surrounding the property began feeding broader theories involving control, access, and future financial implications. Investigators never publicly validated those theories, but they also never fully eliminated them from public speculation. That silence created its own pressure. Then came another detail that deeply affected how the public interpreted the investigation. The emergency call recordings reportedly remained unreleased. Former investigators publicly discussing the case repeatedly emphasized that withholding emergency audio can sometimes carry evidentiary significance. Again, there are many legitimate legal reasons authorities protect recordings during active investigations. But once experienced detectives began openly suggesting the calls could eventually become prosecutorial material, audiences started interpreting every withheld detail through the lens of a future criminal case. Now the investigation no longer felt reactive. It felt strategic. Every silence, every delayed release, every carefully worded statement, everything began feeling like pressure building quietly behind closed doors. The DNA questions only added to that atmosphere. Reports involving unidentified biological material generated enormous speculation online. Analysts publicly discussing the case noted that unidentified DNA creates possibility, not certainty. The presence of unknown biological evidence does not automatically identify an offender, and investigators themselves remain publicly cautious. But psychologically, the unresolved forensic questions intensified the sense that authorities were assembling a much larger picture than the public could fully see. And as that picture developed, another disturbing theory gained momentum. What if the offender did not resemble a traditional criminal at all? Behavioral analysts following the case increasingly discussed the possibility of someone socially integrated, someone organized, calm, emotionally controlled under pressure. Someone capable of maintaining outward normalcy while internally managing a highly structured sequence of events. That profile frightened people more than almost anything else, because strangers are easy to fear. They exist outside ordinary life. But someone familiar, someone trusted, socially functional, emotionally composed forces people to question the safety of the routines surrounding them every day. And the deeper the investigation moved into behavioral reconstruction, the more the public seemed to believe investigators were no longer searching broadly for possibilities. They were narrowing toward familiarity, toward relationship dynamics, toward someone who may already have known exactly how vulnerable Nancy Guthrie had become. What shocked you most, the level of planning or the possibility that someone familiar may already have known everything? Because by now, the biggest question was no longer whether investigators suspected planning. It was something far more unsettling. If investigators were building a circumstantial structure behind closed doors, how close were they to proving it? As the investigation moved deeper into forensic reconstruction and behavioral analysis, one pattern kept resurfacing again and again. Nearly every major element of the case pointed back toward the same central theme: familiarity. Not explosive violence, not uncontrolled rage, not the emotional chaos investigators often associate with impulsive crime. This case increasingly appeared to involve sequence, controlled sequence. Former investigators publicly noted that random offenders typically leave randomness behind. Mistakes, hesitation, improvised decisions. But according to analysts following the case, the operational structure surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance seemed unusually precise. The timing looked narrow. The surveillance disruption appeared deliberate. The overnight silence aligned too perfectly with Nancy's vulnerabilities. And that combination changed how both investigators and the public emotionally interpreted the case. Because once familiarity enters an investigation, every ordinary detail suddenly becomes psychologically heavier. The final family dinner no longer feels routine. The drive home no longer feels insignificant. The silence overnight no longer feels accidental. Everything begins looking connected. Reports later discussed publicly suggested investigators became increasingly interested in how vulnerability and timing intersected inside Nancy's daily life. She reportedly lived within highly predictable routines. She removed her hearing aids before bed. She lived alone. There was no overnight caregiver. No immediate interruption system. To most people, those are simply realities of aging. But to investigators, they can also become operational advantages for someone who already understands them. And that possibility became the emotional engine driving public obsession with the case, because audiences were not simply watching a missing person investigation unfold anymore. They were watching the possible collapse of trust inside an ordinary family structure. That is what made the story so psychologically difficult to look away from. People fear strangers, but they identify with families. Analysts following the case argued that the investigation's emotional power came from exactly that contradiction. The neighborhood looked safe. The evening looked normal. The interactions reportedly appeared ordinary. Yet somewhere inside that ordinary sequence, investigators increasingly appeared to believe planning may have existed quietly beneath the surface. That possibility transformed the case from tragedy into psychological fixation. The deeper investigators moved into behavioral reconstruction, the more the public began interpreting every detail through the lens of hidden intent. Why remove surveillance? Why operate during such a narrow overnight window? Why did the movement surrounding the property reportedly appear so calm? Why did investigators continue focusing so heavily on relationship dynamics instead of broad stranger theories? Former investigators publicly discussing the case repeatedly emphasized an important reality about major prosecutions. Circumstantial cases are often built slowly through convergence rather than dramatic revelation. Not one single piece of evidence, but many smaller pieces tightening together over time. Motive, opportunity, behavioral reconstruction, digital evidence, timeline pressure, forensic sequencing. Individually, each element may still allow innocent explanation. But investigators are trained to analyze cumulative probability, not isolated coincidence. And according to multiple analysts publicly examining the investigation, authorities increasingly appeared to be constructing exactly that type of cumulative structure behind closed doors. That realization intensified national attention even further because people began believing investigators may already understand far more than they were publicly revealing. The unanswered details started feeling intentional. The withheld recordings, the forensic silence, the targeted searches, the continued federal involvement. Everything created the impression of pressure building gradually towards something larger. And perhaps the darkest possibility of all emerged quietly beneath the investigation itself. What if Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was not a sudden act of violence at all? What if it was the final stage of a sequence already developing for months? That question haunted the public because it forced people to reconsider the emotional meaning of every event leading up to the disappearance. The image searches, the operational precision, the familiarity with routines, the understanding of silence, the timing before dawn. None of it felt emotionally random anymore. And in the end, that may be why this case affected so many people so deeply. Because strangers create fear, familiarity creates betrayal. In the end, the most haunting part of the Nancy Guthrie case was never the blood near the doorway, not the masked figure reportedly seen approaching the property, not even the unanswered forensic questions that continued hanging over the investigation month after month. It was the familiarity, because once investigators placed every piece beside the next, the sequence began feeling less like randomness and more like something quietly understood in advance. The final family dinner, the drive home, the overnight silence, the surveillance disruption, the narrowing investigative focus. One detail after another slowly converged toward the same uncomfortable possibility. Someone may have already known exactly how vulnerable Nancy Guthrie would be, during those missing hours before dawn, and that is what made the case so psychologically difficult to forget. The house remained standing. The neighborhood stayed quiet. Life around the investigation continued moving forward. But somewhere inside that silent overnight window, the timeline still remained incomplete. No public arrest, no definitive resolution. Just a growing sense that investigators may have been reconstructing something far more precise behind closed doors than the public could fully see. Because major investigations rarely reveal themselves. All at once, they tighten slowly through timelines, behavior, pressure, and unanswered silence. And somewhere inside those missing overnight hours, investigators may already understand far more than the public realizes. If stories like this stay with you long after the video ends, leave a comment below as a tribute to Nancy Guthrie.